Those of you who have joined us in the past know Dan Klein. He's always one of my favorite presenters. Um, I I will read an abbreviated biography that from the website. Daniel Klein is the professor of economics and the Ginn Chair at the Mercatus Center, George Mason University. He leads the Smithian Political Economy program at GMU Economics, and he's also the chief editor of Econ Journal Watch. He holds degrees from George Mason University and New York University, where in both cases he studied classical liberal traditions of economics. His teaching focuses on economic principles and public policy issues. I'm going to stop there because I think the majority of us know you from
Oh, that's
previous
great.
times.
Wow.
The session is being recorded, and Professor Klein asks that you hold your questions until the end. He's more than happy to take all of our questions, but let's try not to interrupt. Okay?
Thanks so much, Brenda. And it's great to be with everybody. Thank you for listening today. I'm glad to be back. Yeah, so I lead a program in Adam Smith in the GMU Department of Economics. Smith, as you know, was kind of a crowning figure of classical liberalism. Liberalism, as I think I've addressed to this group, started as Smithian liberalism, and for about a good 100 years after that, it was still termed liberalism in that sense. And then it was in the late 19th and into the 20th centuries that a new meaning of liberal came along. I still like the old one, and it was Smith and his friends who actually christened the term liberal for their political and policy outlook. That's what I'll be talking about today. It's still a topic of conversation, classical liberalism in the old sense. And the issue is it anti-democratic? Some people have said that it is, and I think the matter is complicated. I'd say it's basically a no. It's not anti-democratic, but as you'll see, I kind of feel that in some ways, the issue of democracy is not in the central wheelhouse of what classical liberalism is primarily about. So I want to try to explain that. I consider myself an exponent of classical liberalism. I try to develop it and elaborate it and project it and advance it. I'm typical, I guess you could say, or characteristic of the econ, GMU econ brand in that respect. So I'm going to look over a Word document as I go, and I'm going to kind of go through, and I think this will take me 20-ish minutes, and then come up for air and we'll do questions. So as I said, you can really think of The Wealth of Nations here, Smith's big book on political economy. And one of Smith's contemporaries at the time, Dugald Stewart, explained that work and others sought to improve society, quote, not by delineating plans of new constitutions, but by enlightening the policy of actual legislators. They said that, quote, the happiness of mankind depends not on the share which the people possess, directly or indirectly, in the enactment of laws, but on the equity and expediency of the laws that are enacted. So in other words, what he's saying is that this basic liberal outlook you get from The Wealth of Nations and similar works is about what legislators should do as legislators. And the issue of how someone became a legislator is not part of that question. It's not part of what they're really addressing. Like Dugald Stewart says, the prior process of determining who's legislating, and therefore the issue of democracy versus other forms of selection is not really what it was about. It's really not what it was about. That's really one of the main themes I want to just kind of say about classical liberalism. It basically presupposes a stable political system, a stable polity. Doesn't really ask. I mean, it's interesting to ask, and it's another issue, and it's worth addressing. But the basic liberal proposal and plan, as Smith called it, the liberal plan, just presupposes that, and then says, okay, so what laws should legislators enact? And as far as that goes, I think the answer is very clear. And it's summed up in Smith's expression, allowing every man to pursue his own interest, his own way, upon the liberal plan of equality, liberty, and justice. So it's basically leaving people free. I think it's generally a view that opposes a lot of government intervention, a lot of taxation, a lot of big government players in society. You might call all that kind of the governmentalization of social affairs. And I think the classical liberal view is to lean against that, to want to prevent and reduce even the extent to which our affairs are governmentalized, if you will. When I say governmentalized, I mean restrictions on private people making voluntary agreements with each other and trading and doing things with their own property and so forth. Those kind of restrictions. I also mean the taxation and the funding then of big government projects, endeavors, big players in society. As a government employee, I understand the irony or paradox of my taking that kind of view, but so be it. That's the world we live in. Now, with Smith and the liberal plan and others like Smith, there was a ascendancy of this view. There was a sort of moral authorization both of liberal policy as well as of the pursuit of honest income. And this invigorated economic activity and innovation, for example. And this led to what Deirdre McCloskey has called the Great Enrichment, where you see around 1800, the GDP per person really go up quickly, kind of like the blade of the hockey stick, where it starts moving up very quickly and continues. So we get the Great Enrichment, I would say, out of this liberal era that Smith, as I say, is kind of the crest of. Now, let's talk about democracy, or start getting into it. One interesting thing is people looking back on this blessing period of the liberal era and then the Great Enrichment is what they say about how this came to happen. And I won't quote people here, but I could. And what they say is that basically Smith and others and a kind of culture persuaded aristocrats to liberalize. They basically kind of led a movement and an attitude to move in the direction of liberal policy, the liberal plan, the wealth of nations. And as I say, also, it kind of morally authorized economic activity and innovation. And that's how that happened. That's how this great blessing, which has brought so many people out of poverty, it's not the only thing. Obviously, there's more to it about technology and science and everything else. But politically, the change, you got to realize 18th century is aristocratic. And the franchise doesn't expand greatly until later in the 19th century and the 20th century. And something you got to ask yourself is, if it had been democratic all along, say in 1700, would this have ever happened? I mean, would voters have actually supported all this reform and liberalization? Do we really think we would have gotten the liberal era and the Great Enrichment if we had democracy before this happened? I think another interesting thought experiment or illustration is Hong Kong. Hong Kong in the 20th century, the later part of the 20th century, was one of the great Asian tigers. It had very liberal policy, very free markets, low taxes. It had no democracy. It was actually governed by British administrators like John James Cowperthwaite, who did Smithian policy. And you got an Asian tiger. You got allowing every man to pursue his own interests, his own way upon the liberal plan of equality, of liberty and justice. Of course, it wasn't exactly that, but basically, and you got Hong Kong. Would Hong Kong have become Hong Kong if it had democracy in 1950? I don't think so. But let me push on. I know I'm provoking you. I'm going to provoke you with more here, I think. So I want to back up. I want to do some sweeping history through centuries even, and think about how thinking about democracy has changed over a long period. Let's go back to the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries and think about the legitimacy of government, the legitimacy of the sovereign, the monarch, okay? What happens in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, I'm thinking about Britain in particular, but is that there is a switch in the source of legitimacy from God and church to parliament and the legislative assembly, or the legislative assembly. You know, it's not always called parliament, but there's a switch from God and religion to legislation, to the assembly, to the representation of the people. There's a switch here. Now, I want you to realize that in the British history, the legislative body was conceived as a check on the sovereign, as a limitation on the sovereign. It was the king, the monarch, who was the ruler and led the aristocratic class and government policy, and the legislature was a check in the spirit of Magna Carta, going back even further, but then just in the ongoing power of the purse, saying, hey, you can't tax us without, you know, our representatives here agreeing to that, and so on. So the legislature was originally a check on expansive government or activist government, okay? And it was later, and you can think about Rousseau, for example, and then going forward into the 19th century and into the 20th century, where democracy rises up as a new kind of belief system, outlook. I would say quasi-religion, and it is kind of a quasi-religion in Rousseau, where they want the legislative assembly and such to actually kind of become the sovereign, okay, which is the way it is now to a great extent, and what has happened. Especially if you look at Britain, you can see that the monarch is not all that important nowadays. It's actually the parliamentary system that is the sovereign, as it were. So there's a big switch here, and it reflects a deep change in thinking about democracy. I call this the mythologized democracy. Today I feel that democracy is heavily mythologized, and a lot of its strongest exponents, or kind of people who really put up democracy as ideal, as like the leading thing, they tend to call democratic whatever it is they favor. So if something's good, it's democratic. If it's bad, it's anti-democratic. And that's a very, very loose and untraditional notion of democracy. It has a more specific, traditionally has a more specific meaning. Now, let me note that Alexis de Tocqueville saw that all this was happening, and he saw great danger in it. Classical liberalism soberly sees that government is a coercive institution. It's based on force. It's the initiation of force, and that it needs hemming in. It is dangerous. and that liberal principles, Smithian liberal principles and norms and attitudes and culture, like you had in Smith's day, are checks and limits on expansive, intrusive government. Okay, so it's almost like if you think of the culture as a broader constitution, we need liberal principles to limit the Leviathan, you might say. Now, one of the beauty, going back, think about the 18th century, one of the beauties of aristocracy was that the vast majority of people were officially excluded from governing. I know that sounds weird. I'll say it again. One of the beauties of aristocracy was that the vast majority of people were officially excluded from governing. And here's the beauty in that. Here's the thing about that. That means that the vast majority of people could not easily be bamboozled to think that the government acted in their interest. The vast majority of people were skeptical of government because government was a small group of aristocrats and magistrates who governed them, okay? So the attitude towards their governors in the aristocratic age was quite different than it is today. At the same time, that exclusivity of governing ordained a certain responsibility for governing. And hence we have an idea of responsibility with power. The word for that is nobleness, or being noble. In mass democracy, where is the nobility? Okay. And I'd say that in general, nobleness is rare. The mythologized democracy projects a kind of fantasy of consensus, as though we're still in the situation of all of our ancestors 10,000 years ago in the Paleolithic, the end of the Paleolithic past, where 40 of us were in a band and decided by consensus. Modern collectivist politics, I think, and Hayek thinks and others think, modern collectivist politics plays upon these Paleolithic instincts by projecting the nation as a band. And on this sort of fantasy, there is no reason to limit or check the band as a whole. Its consensus knows what is good for the band and faithfully advances that good. If by democracy we are the government, why would we want to put limits and checks on ourselves when striving to advance our common interests? So Tocqueville foresaw the emergence of a quasi-religion of collectivist politics perfumed by democratic mythology. Big collectivist government now fully replaces God as a source of not just legitimacy for the sovereign, but as a source of meaning and validation for individuals in their personal lives. The collectivist nightmare that Tocqueville warned us of is a continuation of displacement of God by temporal powers, basically government powers. And this is channeling Hayek. I could quote him here, but I won't. The problem, of course, in all of this is that the nation is not a small, simple band of 40 people. In the modern complex world, government lacks knowledge, benevolence, competence, interpretations are not shared, and accountability is slight. Government lacks correction mechanisms. Let me say that again. Government lacks correction mechanisms. It never admits its mistakes. It breeds an administrative state, the permanent bureaucracy, and it breeds self-serving ideologies within this whole apparatus. The administrative state is staffed mainly by people who support the parties most eager for governmentalization, and they push incessantly for governmentalization. Now, in the early 20th century, theorists like Robert Michels explained, quote, the iron law of oligarchy, which is that really what happens in these putative democracies is a kind of oligarchy. I mean, it can be quite moving and unstable about who prevails, although actually I think it remains rather stable underneath the surface. elites fashion narratives and lead mobs in an effort to manufacture a phony consensus. There is no escaping these kinds of realities. Again, the major point here is that they're tapping into our instincts of the small band, but we just are not in the small band anymore. So democracy should be demythologized and understood narrowly and traditionally, how the ancients and the medievalists would have understood it. And for that matter, how the founding fathers would have understood it. Democracy is mainly about voting. More democracy means expanding the electorate, expanding the choices of the electorate, expanding the frequency of voting, making the electorate more directly determinative of outcomes. Things like that. Practical, procedural, more voting, more direct voting. That's what it is, really. Okay. Now, none of those dimensions of greater democracy, that is to say, more democracy, are necessarily good. The more numerous the number of voters, think again about that responsibility of power with power and nobility. The more numerous the number of voters, the less a vote means. And the less a vote means, the more fancifully will votes be cast. When 1 million people decide, no one decides, and no one is responsible for the outcome. Since the voter knows his vote doesn't affect the outcome, he is more prone to let delusions sway his choice. People too often indulge false political quasi-religions. In terms of determining electoral outcomes, they simply do not have skin in the game. Now, I do think in another sense, we all do have skin in the game because wisdom is good for you and foolishness is bad for you on just like a personal moral condition level. But people have a hard time learning not to be foolish in politics. I feel that to a great extent, they are indoctrinated and propagandized by various institutions around us. There's much to be said for narrowing the electorate and limiting the role of mass or direct democracy. We are accustomed to many limitations now in voting, so it's not like this is some unfamiliar idea. We have restrictions on age, citizenship, criminal status, jurisdiction. We have restrictions on candidates like term limits, age, birthplace. We have restrictions on directness. Even when we're talking about people elected to office, a lot of people are not even elected to office, they're just appointed. But even when they're elected on office, sometimes it's indirect, as through the Electoral College, or once, up until 1913, the indirect election of senators. The 17th Amendment changed that. So democracy demythologized is kind of a message for today, kind of a message to you all. There are pros and cons. There are trade-offs, and those should be explored calmly and decided prudentially. Democratic mythology, just kind of like, hey, whatever's good, I'm going to call democratic. Whatever is not good, in my view, my personal assessment of the universe, is undemocratic. Democratic mythology should be rejected, and democratic radicalism should be rejected. Okay, so I'm sure there's plenty more we can talk about, but I'll open it up.
Zach, do you want to unmute?
Yes, thank you. A very thought-provoking and one might almost say polemical discussion that you've initiated. I think part of your analysis is indisputably correct. There is no necessary link between a liberal economy and a democracy. If you look, for example, at more recent history, we as a government believed that laissez-faire economics would democratize China, would democratize the ex-Soviet Union. It would find a way to co-opt them into our club, so to speak. That's proven an absolute failure. The theory that somehow if you liberalize, and I'm using the word in the way you use it here, the economy, that democratic systems follow, turned out simply not to be true. Where I part company with you is the idea that somehow there is some sort of natural governmental elite, and only that natural governmental elite can be trusted with managing the country in ways that are small d democratic, i.e. that honor the natural rights of the citizens, that provides the open space for the liberal economy to grow and flourish, that basically prevents the mob from ruling. That strain of analysis goes a ways far back, and in the constitutional debates that we had with Federalists and Anti-Federalists, it held a great deal of sway. That's one of the reasons why we were created a republic and not a democracy. But I have a feeling that in current circumstances, the mass disenfranchisement of a substantial portion of the 350 million people who make up the United States of America would prove to be so revolutionary a concept that we will wind up throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I don't see a way to return to the kind of non-democratic model that I believe you're espousing.
Thank you, Zach. Those are great comments. On what you started with, I agree. I don't think that market liberalism necessarily causes democracy. It might tend to overall, but certainly not reliably. And I think you're quite right about China. But I hadn't said that that's one of my reasons for favoring market liberalism. It's not a primary reason at all. I would say the primary reason. Oh, whose phone is that? Is that my phone?
No.
No. Okay. Yeah. Anyway, my primary reasons would be for other things. But so that I completely agree with you there. Now, you speak of me, first of all, proposing reductions in democracy, or 10% less democracy. My colleague Garrett Jones wrote a book called 10% Less Democracy. So do we want to reduce some of this directness or frequency or other dimensions of voting? And I'm not even really particularly saying that. I'm more saying that they want to be decided prudentially and realistically. And you spoke of kind of my having a tacit presumption of a natural government elite. Not really. I mean, I think that, if the group of us, we're how many right now, the 41 of us, or for somehow, don't ask me how this might happen, but for some reason, we were put in charge of some important governmental decisions. And it was just up to the 41 of us. And really, it was just us. And we could sit down and we could talk and we could get to know each other. We could work through our arguments. I think, and we would be accountable. We would be the ones who made the decision. We would develop leaders and spokesmen and procedure. We would be more responsible than 41,000 decision makers or voters. That's all I'm saying. I'm not really talking even about a selection or making sure of some elite selection. I actually think that when a person is more individually responsible for a decision and its aftermath, they decide more responsibly. I do think people are moral. I do think people, we have a kind of instinct towards the good of the whole. And our understandings of that then are expressed and made accountable. And so that's why I think, that's the virtue of smaller numbers in certain kinds of decision making. We wouldn't want to take a vote about whether Bob should get heart surgery. You want Bob and his family to decide. You want them to make that decision themselves because they're the ones with the strongest incentives and best local knowledge to make those kinds of decisions. So it just doesn't, there's just no magic in more people better wisdom, more wisdom. It just doesn't follow. So it's not really about a presumption about getting the elite, getting the proper elite, the wise and virtuous, and kind of trying to keep it to that. I actually just think that being more confined makes you more wise and virtuous. When you're publicly accountable, everyone knows it's your decision, you own it. So that's more the flavor there, Zach.
Well, I would assume then that you would disagree with the Federalists when they argued that enlarging the orbit is the thing you're supposed to do in our governmental structure. Let interest groups contend amongst themselves and not have this one self-selected minority, for whatever reason, control the levers of government. I would assume you disagree with that analysis.
So you're saying the Federalists are saying
the Federalists basically said, and I believe it was Fed 10, that the way to manage our government is to broaden the scope, is to let factions, let interest groups contend in order to prevent faction fighting, essentially, if I recall it correctly.
So what they're broadening here is the franchise?
No, they were broadening the scope of the people's ability to participate in government.
In the sense of being able to petition the government?
In order, enlarging the orbit to them, I believe, meant something that Mao is infamous for saying in a different context, letting 100 flowers bloom and 1,000 schools of thought contend. But in obviously in the founders' case, they meant it, whereas Mao, of course, did not. But I don't mean to be pedantic. I'm sorry if I'm coming across that way.
No, I'm just trying to translate it into kind of the nuts and bolts of a issue of more or less democracy, and what.
Well, the founders certainly did not want to have a ruling aristocracy class. They did not want a monarchy for precisely that reason. They wanted a republic.
Yeah.
They were not trying to create a democracy. They did not.
Okay.
And the idea that senators are now directly elected.
Yeah. Okay. So it's kind of about an aristocratic model versus a Republican model, I guess. And I don't disagree with them. I mean, aristocracy has its failures too, to be sure. I mean, when you get locked into, they don't admit necessarily, do things right. And then there's all sorts of weird selection processes there where incompetent people take over, the position. And then what do you do about it? So, like I say, we have to decide each of these things prudentially in historical context and everything else. I'm not exactly sure what. Yeah.
I like your point about the accountability factor. That we don't have accountability in our current environment. Hugh has a question. Hugh?
Yes. What do you think Adam Smith would think about modern labor unions that have monopoly powers and can bring an economy to a closure? Wouldn't that be kind of against his notions of monopolies?
Yes, I think it is. And I think he would be against any kind of privileges that give certain kinds of workers power or exclusivity as compared to other kind of workers. And certainly parts of the labor law do that. I think that's right. I think he was very concerned about workers. He was very concerned about the poor. One of the important things about Adam Smith is that he very explicitly and emphatically sort of said that everyone counts equally as in the social in the good of the whole. It doesn't matter how poor or rich you are. And what did he propose to help the poor or to help, the workers? And it was market liberalism. And he was against different kinds of restrictions and privileges in the labor market.
several years ago, I'm not sure if it was you or one of your colleagues, presented an idea where we would vote for a group of individuals that would go off for maybe a month or 2 months a year and come up with a plan, budget, a policy, an agenda. And this committee, per se, was elected by the general population. But then this committee would be basically accountable for the results of their program or idea, instead of pure democracy where you basically have a group of experts that are going to make decisions on how we do things.
It wasn't me.
Okay.
I'm not sure who it was.